Welcome friends to another video lecture for Greek exegesis of Revelation. The title of this lecture is The Language of Revelation. The majority of this lecture is going to be building on and explaining some of the article in the thesis written by Dwigh Callahan titled The Language of the Apocalypse. What I want to do in this lecture is to start with a sort of broad overview of a variety of assessments of Revelation's language, particularly those negative characteristics of its language. Then to review some of the typical explanations that have been offered for why the Greek of Revelation seems so strange and so odd. Then I want to spend a good amount of time thinking through the explanation that Callahan offers in his own article, and then conclude with a few brief reflections about why any of this should matter to you in this class or beyond as you continue to read, interpret, teach, and preach from Revelation. As I said earlier, there have been a number of rather negative assessments of the Greek style or the Greek grammar and syntax of Revelation. And this is not just by modern scholars. In fact, one of our very earliest interpreters of Revelation, Dionysius of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century, had this to say about the Greek of Revelation. He says, "I observe his style and that his use of the Greek language is not accurate, but that he employs barbarous idioms, in some places committing downright solecisms." For Dionysius, the author of Revelation is not up to speed with the Greek, we might say, and commits errors and doesn't follow the rules of Greek grammar, it appears. Similarly, but much later, Martin Luther, in his prefaces to the New Testament, says this about Revelation: "Moreover, the seer seems to be going much too far when he commends his own work so highly, more than any of the other sacred books do, though they are much more important, and threatens that if anyone takes away anything from it, God will deal likewise with him. Again, they are to be blessed who keep what is written therein, and yet no one knows what that is, to say nothing of keeping it." Now, Martin Luther's comments need a bit unpacking. The first that you need to know is that these prefaces of the New Testament effectively identify Luther's canon within the canon. Those books which he thinks are the most important, like 1 Peter and John and Romans, and those books that he thinks are of less significance and less importance, like Revelation and James. It's in these very same prefaces that you may remember he calls the Epistle to James the Epistle to Straw, or the Epistle of Straw, rather. And so his view of Revelation is similar to that of James. He really doesn't have a lot of interest in it. He doesn't think that it's a very important book for Christian communities, and we see this. But it's that last line, the polemical last line of this quotation, that says, yeah, great, you would be blessed if you keep the words of Revelation. Too bad nobody can understand it. And of course, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but again, represents an assessment of the Greek style and grammar of Revelation. As Callahan surveys in his article, there have been 3 scholarly explanations of this problematic Greek style in Revelation. The first explanation is that there was an original Semitic version of Revelation, whether written in Aramaic or in Hebrew, that was eventually translated. And so Revelation, as we encounter it in the Greek New Testament, is a translation, and therefore there are certain errors that have been introduced as a result of translation. The assumption there being that the Aramaic or the Hebrew version would be far superior and improved. The second explanation that is typically offered is that these errors in grammar are simply inadvertent errors introduced by the author's own carelessness or we might say by the author's own lack of familiarity with Greek. So maybe there wasn't an original Hebrew or Aramaic, but maybe the author of Revelation never really grasped the Greek language adequately. And so these errors are introduced accidentally because of his lack of knowledge or his carelessness. The third is to suggest that Revelation represents a form of pidgin or ghetto Greek. That's the language that Callahan uses. This sort of distinct dialect of diaspora Judaism. These are the sort of three suggestions that are often offered as why Revelation looks the way that it does. With these explanations in mind, I think it will be a good time to dive into Callahans' response and his own argument. But before doing so, I wanted to provide a brief orientation to Dr. Alan Dwigh Callahan and his other work and a little bit of his background. So Dr. Callahan earned a PhD in New Testament from Harvard Divinity School in 1992. He, according to his LinkedIn profile, is an independent scholar, a consultant, and a community organizer. In terms of his scholarly production, he has written several important books. His most recent book is the talking book, African Americans and the Bible. But he has also written books on Nimrod and the Johannine community and Paul's letter to Philemon and the slavery of Onesimus. Callahan's basic thesis is that the errors in grammar, in syntax, in the Greek book of Revelation are intentional. They're not accidental. They're not the result of translation. They're not the result of carelessness. They are intentional. And then he says that once we sort of accept that, then we need to learn to appreciate what he calls the intentionality and the insurgency of the text. So that's the thesis, that's the point. And let us see how he gets there. In order to get there, he has to deal with some of his predecessors' arguments, those who have come before him and made the conclusions that they've made, which have come to shape the understanding of Revelation. One of the most important examples of that is R.H. Charles, whose commentary on Revelation from 1920 provided the most thorough and erudite treatment of this problem with the Greek of Revelation, at least at the time of the writing of the article. Charles concludes that the author of Revelation writes in Greek, but he thinks in Hebrew. That seems to be the shorthand explanation, that really the author just is a Hebrew thinker and is struggling to reproduce in Greek his original Hebrew or Aramaic, his Semitic thoughts. So Callahan considers this suggestion by Charles, and he makes two or three important points. The first is he says many of the examples surveyed by Charles are actually not all that strange when you consider the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Many of the forms and the so-called breaking of the rules are actually already found in the Septuagint. And because of this, the author of Revelation is simply following in line with this earlier Greek tradition. The other thing that Callahan points out is that some of these apparent errors or mistakes in the Greek of Revelation are actually found in wider Greek literature by authors that no critic would think were, unaware of the rules of Greek or poor writers of Greek. And so this leads then Callahan to conclude that actually these supposed errors or missteps are actually quite deliberate in character. So one example from the article is the preposition apo, which usually takes the genitive case after it. Well, in a few places in the first chapter of Revelation, it's apo, but then it's the nominative case. It goes apo and then nominative case, which is, from a literal or a strict perspective, is inaccurate Greek. But Callahan surveys this and says, no, wait, this is actually intentional, because elsewhere in Revelation, when the preposition apo occurs, it doesn't always have a nominative. Very often, most of the time, it follows the rules of grammar. And so this supposed error in the Greek revelation is actually a deliberate choice on the part of the author. In addition to responding to Charles, he responds to the suggestion that Revelation is just creolized Greek. And this was made popular by a scholar by the name of Stephen Thompson. And Callahan's response is much shorter, and it's easy to sort of replicate, which is there's just very little historical references to support this conclusion. While there is evidence for a distinct dialect or an accent among certain Jews, like the Jews that lived in the Nazarene region, there is no mention of what Callahan calls ghetto Greek of the Jews. There is no evidence to suggest that the Greek that Jews spoke in diaspora was somehow significantly different from that of the wider Greco-Roman world. And so this leads Callahan again to restate and reinforce his conclusion, which is that these errors, supposed errors in the text of Revelation, are actually intentional and deliberate modifications of the Greek syntax. And so this then leads him to a consideration of moving from what a text means to considering its effect. What is a text doing before what is a text meaning? And so as he explores this in the case of Revelation with some of its stylistic and grammatical peculiarities, he concludes that this text is engaging in insurgency, that it is engaging in subaltern discourse, a concept derived from Simon Rushdie's work, that although it is speaking and it is written in the hegemonic, in the dominant language of the time, in Greek, its intentional and insurgent changes to that language are themselves a sort of subversive and subaltern response. It is a way of deliberately engaging that dominant culture and in small and not so small ways, sort of challenging it and reversing it. So why should you care? Why should you care about the language of Revelation, especially in a class like this, in the midst of your preparation at seminary? Well, I think that the first reason you should care is that you should, as you engage this material and you consider the translation of Revelation, you should expect exceptions to some of the rules that you learned in your basic Greek grammar classes and in your Greek grammar textbooks. The next thing is you should be on the lookout for the ways in which commentaries deal with these difficulties. What sorts of rationales or explanations do they offer? And why might that be important for understanding the text, or why might that be problematic for understanding the text? Then the third thing that you might care about is the reality of textual variance. One of the things that we see in the history of interpretation with Revelation is that subsequent readers of Revelation thought that they were better grammarians than Revelation, that they understood the Greek language better. And so they made certain improvements to the Greek of Revelation to correct it and to make it more accurate according to these Greek standards. And so as you consider and see textual variance in a critical Greek text like the Nestle-Aland 28, or even just in the footnotes of a study Bible, it's important for you to understand some of the why. Why do these textual variants come about in the first place? And one of the real reasons is because of Revelation's distinctive use of the Greek language. And then the fourth sort of takeaway is broader and bigger than syntax and grammar alone. And it is Callahan's attention to the workings of texts. Not just the meanings, but the workings. What do texts do? What is their function? How do they work? Very often, and I think that Callahan does a great job pointing this out, very often interpretation has a tendency of narrowing the range of functions, or of simplifying, or of taking away perhaps some of the capacity or the potential of these texts. And so for a work like Revelation, we are in a good place when we remember that these texts were working on people, that they were intended to do certain things. And it reminds us, I think, of the earlier lecture on Schussler Fiorenza and her own rhetorical approach to Revelation that says that if we're going to understand Revelation, we need to understand more clearly how it is working, how it is making its arguments, and what might the intended effects or consequences of that rhetoric be. Well, I hope that this lecture on the language of Revelation will clarify things as you continue to engage this text, and hopefully it will give you an eye for being on the lookout for some grammatical or syntactical abnormalities, and maybe the ways that those abnormalities reveal some of what the author was trying to do with his work and his writing. Thank you so much for your attention.